Oh my
Power doesn't
God.
fall in a day, but it breaks in a moment. As the sun rose over Abidjan, the city awoke to an eerie calm. Military vehicles patrolled the streets, not to enforce fear, but to assure stability. Radio stations, long censored under government control, buzzed with something new: expectancy, anticipation, a quiet revolution nearing its final act. At the center of this moment was a single message, broadcast anonymously at 3:27 a.m. on all major frequencies. Alassane Ouattara is expected to resign publicly in the next few hours. Prepare for transition, prepare for ownership. The country didn't panic. It exhaled. For over a decade, Ouattara had reigned as Ivory Coast's unmovable president, first hailed as a reformer, later condemned as a constitutional manipulator, a leader whose grip on power came not from consensus, but from courts, contracts, and the quiet cooperation of foreign backers. But the streets had changed. This was no longer the Ivory Coast of IMF blueprints and French speeches on regional stability. This was a nation reborn in the fire of its own awakening. And the man once thought untouchable was now waiting, surrounded, watched, but not yet broken. In military compounds, the final preparations were underway. Journalists were summoned, cameras were cleaned, the national flag was hoisted, not for show, but for symbolism. It wasn't just about removing a president, it was about retiring a chapter of African submission disguised as diplomacy. He came with Western praise. Now he would leave with African pressure. The world was watching, and the clock was ticking. Every resignation has a history, every downfall, a trail of ignored warnings. The impending resignation of Alassane Ouattara was not born in a day. It was the inevitable climax of a decade-long dance between illusion and control. When he came to power in 2011, Ouattara was framed as a savior. A technocrat with World Bank credentials, a stabilizer after post-election chaos, a partner to the West, a model of progress in Francophone Africa. But beneath the suit and praise, something else was forming. Year after year, term after term, the line between reformer and ruler blurred. In 2020, Ouattara controversially ran for a third term, citing a constitutional reset. Protests exploded, civilians were killed, opponents jailed or exiled. The international community, they issued mild statements and moved on. Because for them, Ouattara was still predictable. And predictability is the currency of global influence. But inside Ivory Coast, patience wore thin. Unemployment rose, public services collapsed, corruption bloomed like mold beneath development contracts. Meanwhile, French troops maintained a training presence, and international firms controlled mining rights from Abidjan to the Burkina Faso border. People were no longer just frustrated, they were aware. Then came Burkina Faso, then Mali, then Niger, and with each fallen leader, the question grew louder. If they could do it, why not us? Inside the Ivorian military, a faction began to form. Young, disciplined, nationalist, led by officers who had trained not in Paris, but in Ouagadougou and Conakry. They didn't want chaos. They wanted clarity. And in the early hours of a quiet Monday, they took control, without a shot fired. Ouattara was placed under protective custody, the presidency sealed, the people informed. He will speak, he will resign, and we will begin again. History is not written by those who win power. It is written by those who let go of it, too late. When a king loses his throne, the silence in the palace becomes louder than the people outside. Inside a secure facility outside Yamoussoukro, Alassane Ouattara sat in quiet isolation. No entourage, no red carpets, no handlers, just military guards and a folded statement in his hands, the speech he was expected to read. It wasn't a script from the generals, it wasn't revenge, it was an invitation to accountability. The document opened with 4 simple words: to the people of Ivory Coast. It ended with the most anticipated line in Ivorian history: I hereby resign. But Ouattara hesitated, not out of arrogance, but fear. Fear of being abandoned by the same powers that once championed him. Fear that a decade of global partnerships, strategic alliances, and institutional trust had amounted to nothing more than borrowed legitimacy. And he was right. France, his long-standing backer, had not intervened. The US issued a generic call for a peaceful transition. and ECOWAS, always cautious, remained silent. The man who once moved with presidential motorcades now paced alone. Meanwhile, General Sékou Doumbia, leader of the Military Transition Council, reviewed the logistics of the upcoming press event. He had made it clear, this will not be a spectacle, this will be closure. Doumbia knew that forcing a resignation meant nothing if the people didn't witness dignity in departure. The broadcast had been scheduled. Reporters were en route. All that remained was a decision. Ouattara was given time, an hour to reflect, to read, to choose. Outside, the city waited, not with rage, but with readiness. Markets remained open, schools resumed, but eyes never left the screens. Because at any moment, the curtain would rise on an unthinkable scene. A man who once stood as Africa's modern face, now speaking as its fallen memory. Every dictatorship ends, but not every one ends with a camera. Ivory Coast had made its choice. The world would witness the truth, not just hear about it. When truth is finally spoken, it doesn't echo, it detonates. At exactly 11 a.m., the screen faded from black to a single image. Alassane Ouattara, seated behind a wooden desk. No presidential seal, no flags, just a microphone, 2 folded hands, and a camera. The room was still, no military presence, no visible handlers, just a man, and history watching him. He took a breath and began. My fellow Ivorians, I address you today not as a leader, but as a citizen. Not as a president, but as a man who understands that his time has passed. There was no anger, no deflection, just words that landed like stone on glass. For years, I believed I was holding this nation together. But in truth, I was holding it back. I confused stability with control, and I mistook foreign praise for national progress. Then came the line that drew gasps across living rooms, classrooms, and military posts. Yes, I admit, I served global interests more than I served you, not always out of malice, but often out of fear that without them, we could not stand. A pause. But you have proven me wrong. In these past days, you have shown courage, peace, and unity. So today, I step aside, not as a man defeated, but as one awakened. Effective immediately, I resign from the office of President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. Then silence, no anthem, no marching band, just a still frame, as if even the cameras were unsure of what to do next. Across the nation, people didn't cheer, they wept, not for Ouattara, for themselves, for what they had endured in silence. In that moment, a nation was not just watching a resignation, it was witnessing a revelation. Power had left the building, but more importantly, so had fear. When a man falls quietly, the world panics loudly. Within an hour of Ouattara's resignation, headlines circled the globe. From BBC to Al Jazeera, from Le Monde to CNN, the wording was similar, but the tone varied. Ivorian president resigns amid military transition, unexpected end to longtime Western allies' rule, new model for African power shifts. But behind closed doors in Paris, Brussels, and Washington, panic set in. France, which had invested decades propping up Ivorian regimes favorable to its interests, had just lost its last solid ally in the West African corridor. The Élysée Palace scrambled for damage control. Calls were made, advisors drafted contingency plans. French business leaders worried about their mining and telecom assets. Privately, a leaked diplomatic cable revealed the fear. If the Doumbia doctrine takes hold, we risk a domino effect across the Francophone bloc. Meanwhile, the United States released a bland 2-line statement. We respect the decision of President Ouattara and support a peaceful, democratic transition. But the truth was clear. Washington had been caught off guard, and their silence now revealed not diplomacy, but distance. Back in Africa, the response was more direct. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea praised the peaceful transition and called it a victory for African dignity. Niger's Transitional Council sent an open letter. Ivory Coast has shown courage. We now walk the same road. Cameroon and Togo stayed eerily quiet, fearing similar waves. But the real power shift wasn't in statements. It was in what people believed now possible. In Senegal, students took to the streets with signs, "If he can go, so can ours." In the DRC, a youth activist shouted on live TV, "Africa doesn't need the UN to supervise its future anymore. We're doing it ourselves." A resignation had become a rupture. The illusion that African sovereignty must come with foreign approval was shattered. Power isn't seized when it's forced. It's earned when it's refused. As the world absorbed Ouattara's resignation, all eyes turned to the man behind the scenes, General Sékou Doumbia. But Doumbia did not appear at the palace. He did not take to the stage. He did not declare himself president. Instead, he stepped into a modest conference hall wearing no medals, just a plain uniform and conviction in his voice. His message was clear: we are not here to lead, we are here to reset. The room erupted in silent disbelief. This was a coup that had removed a sitting president without seeking to replace him with another ruler. General Doumbia laid out his plan: a 90-day national consultation period involving civil society, youth groups, religious leaders, and women's coalitions. The formation of a transitional civic assembly made up of civilians, not soldiers, a ban on any military official running in the next elections, the immediate launch of audits into foreign military, trade, and energy agreements, an open call to African nations for regional cooperation on sovereign governance models. He ended his speech with a line that would go viral across the continent: "We are not taking power, we are returning it to the soil that birthed it." Across Africa, the phrase, "returning it to the soil," became a slogan, spray-painted on walls in Bamako, printed on shirts in Conakry, trending on social media from Lagos to Johannesburg. Doumbia's refusal to claim authority was not weakness. It was strategy. He understood that the real victory was not just in toppling a leader, but in toppling the very idea that only generals or foreign-trained economists could run African states. For the first time in modern Ivorian history, power wasn't held, it was handed back. The nation stood still again, this time not out of fear, but respect. The general had cleared the board, and now, for the first time in decades, Ivorians would decide what to build on it. When the seat of power is vacated, it doesn't stay empty. It returns to those it was stolen from. In the days following General Doumbia's announcement, Ivory Coast experienced something unprecedented: decentralized democracy in motion. Across the country, town halls opened, not for bureaucracy, but for debate. Youth associations, tribal councils, women's cooperatives, and trade unions were invited to participate in what was now being called the National Reassembly. Every region sent its voices, not politicians, not corporate executives, citizens. In Bouaké, farmers debated land sovereignty. In San Pedro, fishers demanded marine protection from foreign trawlers. In Abobo, students proposed banning campaign financing from foreign entities. In Man, retired teachers suggested a Pan-African history curriculum to replace French textbooks. It wasn't perfect, but it was the most honest political process Ivory Coast had ever seen, and people were engaged. Radio stations gave hourly updates on the forums. Newspapers published community proposals on their front pages. Social media was flooded with the hashtag Ivoirien et souverain, Ivorian and sovereign. Then came a moment that shook the continent. A 16-year-old girl from Grand Bassam took the stage at one of the assemblies and said, "We don't just want to vote every 5 years. We want to speak every day. That's what sovereignty means." Her clip was viewed 14 million times in 48 hours. From the diaspora in France to the streets of Dakar, the message was clear. Ivory Coast wasn't just resetting its government, it was reclaiming its identity. This was no longer about who ruled. It was about how a people, long silenced, had remembered their voice and demanded it stay heard. It is not enough to tear down a regime. You must build something it fears more: hope. With the constitutional reform process underway and foreign influence receding, Ivory Coast faced its most important test yet: Reconstruction. But this time, it wasn't about roads and skyscrapers. It was about reconstructing trust. For too long, citizens had viewed government as a distant predator, predatory in contracts, predatory in taxes, and blind to suffering. Now, local committees began restoring that trust block by block. In Korhogo, engineers and youth groups launched a community-run solar energy project. In Ganyoa, women's associations partnered with students to create a food co-op network. In Abidjan, a volunteer-led task force began auditing ghost schools and restoring abandoned clinics. The military was not in charge of these efforts. It stood in the background, visible but not controlling. General Doumbia, in one of his few public appearances, gave a short message. "We were trained to defend borders, but now we are trained to defend hope." International institutions like the World Bank and IMF attempted to re-engage, but this time they were told, no loan without local oversight, no investment without value retention, no partnership without parity. It was a new doctrine, radical to some, obvious to others. A new constitution was drafted and circulated for feedback. For the first time in the country's history, it included term limits that could not be changed without a national referendum, a law requiring all public officials to disclose offshore assets, the creation of a Pan-African Relations Office to promote South-South diplomacy, and the diaspora returned by the hundreds. Engineers from Canada, doctors from Belgium, artists and academics from the US, UK, and Morocco, not to lecture, not to rescue, but to belong. Ivory Coast was no longer waiting for saviors. It was becoming its own answer, and its question to the world had changed from, "Will you help?" to, "Can you keep up?" We were told our destiny would always be dictated, but Ivory Coast just wrote its own chapter. 12 months after Alassane Ouattara's resignation, the country held its most transparent and inclusive election in history. No violence, no suppression of opposition, no foreign observers flown in to certify democracy, just Ivorian citizens choosing their future freely. The winning coalition was not a party in the traditional sense. It was a civic movement. Nouvelle Racine, the new root, a coalition of activists, technocrats, farmers' unions, cultural leaders, veterans, youth collectives, their campaign slogan, La terre, la vérité, le peuple. The land, the truth, the people. On Inauguration Day, there was no parade of foreign dignitaries, no red carpet for former colonial powers. Instead, the ceremony took place in a public square. The people stood with the president. The military saluted the citizens. General Doumbia declined to attend. He had returned to the north to a quiet life, saying, "I will not become what we fought to undo." In his final public statement, he wrote, "If we've proven anything, it is this, that Africa does not need permission to be free. We only need to remember who we are when we stand alone and together." Across Africa, something shifted permanently. In Chad, opposition groups formed their own sovereignty forums. In Togo, young officers refused to be deployed for crowd suppression. In Senegal, a referendum was proposed to review all post-colonial treaties signed without public approval. And across the diaspora, the message was clear. Africa is no longer waiting for change. We are changing what we wait for. The West didn't collapse, but it lost something it never admitted it had: control. And in its place, a new African century quietly began, not in headlines, but in homes, in schools, in silence turned into speech. Ivory Coast didn't just remove a president, it removed the fear of trying. And in doing so, it reminded a continent that the future belongs to those who stop asking for it and start living it. The sound of children playing, a new anthem rising, not from the government, but from the streets.